Welcome back. I'm Bill. So here's something different. Some guys in the Canadian Collectors group on Facebook asked me to make a video, so I'm doing that tonight. This weekend I'm having an open house, putting some of my collection on display here in the garage, and inviting anybody who wants to come and have a look at it. If you're in the area in the Comox Valley on Vancouver Island or nearby, you're welcome to come by if you see this in time. I've done this a few times in the past. This time I'm trying to put out some of the older and more unique stuff. In the past I had a lot of green stoves because that's one of the things that interests me, and I realized a lot of people, especially people who aren't collectors, don't see all the subtle variations. So I started out here. I've got a 974D cabin stove, late 40s, early 50s, something like that here. One of the more unique and larger pieces. This is the only time it ever comes out of the crawl space, and sitting on it is a PQ chandelier. For some reason the left side there isn't burning quite as brightly as the right. Have to take care of that. Yeah, these are some neat pieces. The PQ I picked up last year when I was down in the States. It's an American model. The 974D is Canadian. Most of the stuff I've got here, I'm not an eBayer, at least not a buyer, so all of this stuff was either found in the wild or I traded with other collectors, but mostly it was found in the wild, and mostly locally. The exception is over on this side, the stoves. These are mostly Model 9s. You can see a Model 2D here, which I'll be making coffee and probably some cinnamon buns tomorrow morning. That's Model 2. All of these stoves are American models. I think the 9D came from a collector over on the mainland who sold it to me a number of years ago, and the Albert Lee stove there, the number 33, this guy. Sorry I didn't do a YouTube video on the restoration of that. I just kind of wanted to do that at my own pace and have fun with it. I picked this up down in the States. But these other Colemans here, these are all American. My focus has always been mainly on Canadian Coleman models, but older Canadian stoves like Model 2s and Model 9s seem to be virtually non-existent. I know they didn't make as many, obviously, as they did in the US, but they just are really, really, really hard to find. I've never found one in the wild, so I've got American versions here. And start down here, we've got a original Model 9, so that would have been roughly 1924 or so, and sitting on there are a Canadian 327 and 427 lanterns. Those are quick lights. And then we've got a 9C, which was the second version of the Model 9, and that's a Canadian 220 slant L220 on the left and an American 220B on the right. I do not, you may be surprised, I do not have a Canadian 220 or 228B. They have eluded me. I found a couple but always got scooped on them. And then we've got an American 2D, that's the one with the oven. And then the 9D, which is otherwise identical. And I haven't put everything out. So I've got on the left there an very early 247, 242B in the middle, and I think it's a 1948 249 there. I've also got a Seafoam Vent 249 that I didn't bring out. You can see here, this is what this stove looked like when I got it from the other collector. It was pretty rough. So it has been stripped in my electrolysis tank and fully repainted. And then we've got a 9E. This is original. It's been cleaned up a lot, and it's one of my favorites. This was Coleman's first instant light stove. I've also got a 2E, but got it from another collector who sandblasted it, and it's got issues, and it's missing a generator, so I've never bothered to work on it or restore it or anything, but one of these days I will. And then sitting on there on the left, the one that's lit is an Akron 103, and the one that's not lit, that's an Akron 132 AG. The 132 AG, actually I've got videos on both of these. The 132 is sort of an instant light lantern. The 103 is virtually identical to a Coleman quick light, like a 327. It's just got an S generator instead of a looped generator. And we've got a 4A iron down here that I will be making a video on eventually. I haven't done anything with it. I've got the box as well. My daughter got that for me. Got a custom BC Parks lantern that I made a few years ago. That's a 321B or C. And then we move over here, and I've got 3 of my 236 variants here. The one on the right's a 236A, and then we're a little stumped on what this cabin or what this hot plate is. I think it's a 320 or 381C. But the burner grates may be off a 382, because the 381 had plain wire grates, and this has some really nice cast iron ones. So someone may have stolen some cast iron grates and put them on there. I'm not sure, but it's either a 381 or 382 of some flavor. And then I get into the green stoves. I haven't done a whole lot with them. I've got a bunch of 4s and 6s. They made these in the F8 or FH and J varieties. The 4 was sort of the economy, the Vagabond, and the 6 was the nicer version with an Everdur tank, the Forester. This one's some previous owner, to preserve it, painted it black inside, but otherwise it's original and it's in pretty nice shape. And then that's a Summer Light LP lantern. That's a Canadian version up there. You can no longer get canisters for those. And there's the companion Summer Light stove with a canister in it. That canister is empty, so I have never fired it. I've got a 5A, but I put the 5B out instead. This one's all original. I've got the box for it. And then you've got kind of the 3 main variants of the Canadian 200 and 200A there on the middle and right. So you've got the nickel fount 200 from about 1953, and then a later tall vent 200 from about 1963, and then on the right it's a 1970 200A. The one on the left, there's one that a fellow clergyman friend passed along to me that belonged to his parents. Very nice of him. That's a 1951 200A, an American one. They call it a Christmas lantern because of the green fount and the red vent, and that's a nice one too. I brought out a few lamps, not too many. I'm really trying not to be a lampy, but I've got a BQ down there. That's an Aladdin shade on it, but I've got a BQ down there that I picked up locally from someone who had a whole bunch of Aladdins and wasn't really interested in the Coleman. It's Canadian. There's a CQ up there with a 329 shade and a 138. They call that the Duchess with the sailing ship shade. And over on the right, there's a 168K. That's all complete as it came out of the box. I had to do some restoration work on the shade. It's a little rough. That's a kerosene model. And then the Carolite, that's an American one that I picked up while I was in the States. It is missing the mantle. I haven't actually got it running yet, but I thought I'd put it out. One of these days I'll make a video with that. But the mantles are kind of expensive these days, and I need the holder as well as the mantle. So in the past I did a lot. I had these tables loaded with green stoves, and I'm not doing that so much this time. So I've got a little Seafoam display here. I've got a 236 there on the left. It's kind of got the bicolor thing going on, and 1945 237. I did polish the collar on that. Someone tried to run gasoline in it and turned it into a fireball, and the paint was scorched and and flaking off. And then a 242B and a Seafoam 500 here that I restored in a video a while ago. And those are sitting on American 3F that I restored a number of years back before I was making videos. And then we've got the Pre-Way and Prentice Weber stuff going on here. Apart from those two 500s, a 500 and a 500A, those are Canadian. This is a Pre-Way 4522. There should be a video up on the channel before too long on this. and Sears Jr., which was made by Prentice Weber there. That was a recent restoration as well. Both of those are American. And then we've got a Prentice Weber's Auto Cook Kit number 4. That's probably mid to late 20s. I think this is the one that it was sized to fit in a toolbox on a Model T running board. And this is all original. I did a video on this a while back and showed you how to clean up old damaged paint without repainting. The 4522, that's 1945, 1946 or so, and the lantern, as far as I can tell, is probably mid to late 30s. And I've got a glass globe on there. I'm pretty sure this particular one came with a Pyrex globe. It was missing, but I found an Ash Flash propane globe. Fits very nicely. And we go around here's some common stuff. There's a very early 4M stove. This is a very early 4K stove. You can usually spot 4Ks because it's one of the few Canadian stoves that has those wavy wire holders for the windscreens. And then I've got two American 220F and 228F. Now, I had to put this out. This 228F, it's kind of, in a way, what got me started collecting. This lantern is 68. My parents bought it on their honeymoon in 69 in Portland because they were camping one night at Crater Lake, and they bought some minimum camping supplies. And I grew up with this lantern, and it didn't get me collecting, but it kind of got me interested. What got me collecting was I thought we had my grandpa's old 425 stove, and when I realized my dad had thrown it out, I went to a junk shop and bought a stove to go on our first camping trip. And it was a hodgepodge. It was a 431 case with a 421 of some variety tank. And I started realizing, the Easy Light instructions don't match this tank. So I started looking online, and that's when I discovered that there are all these different variants of Coleman stoves, even the green ones that all look the same. And so I took an interest in that, and that was actually what I first started collecting. I've actually got, with one exception, I still need a decent 433, the original no-letter version. They're always too rough, or people are asking too much. But I have all of the Coleman stoves going back to World War II. So lots of green stoves, but I didn't put them out this time. I showed some restraint because most people would find that boring. Yeah, the stoves are so fun to restore. That's kind of what got me into it. But this old lantern is part of my camping and collecting history. So here we've got, this is a neat Canadian oddball. This is a 414. It's a unique stove. It's kind of their first large format stove before the 444 came out and replaced it. And we've got a 220E there on the left and a 220F on the right. These are both the Canadian models, obviously different than the American 220E and 220F, and there were no 228 versions made in Canada. And then we come around here. This is the 4M. This is an early version, and I've got a American 220D and 228D. The 228D I traded with another collector in the States, and the 220 is a nice one. A college friend of mine gave it to me after her father left it when he passed away, and that's a recent restoration. I think I've got a video ready to post. I just haven't posted it yet. And of course the 4M, that's sort of the quintessential common Canadian stove. They're everywhere, and they went through about 4 or 5 different variations. I have all of them, but I did not put them out. And we'll go around here. I've got sort of the Euro lantern and Euro stoves. Petromax 828 that I just got working, rebuilt with a kit and everything. That'll be in a video soon. And an Optimus 99 and a Svea 123, both Swedish backpacking stoves. And an Aida 100. I'm missing a burner for this, but it's a beautiful stove nevertheless, and it's in the metal box. And then, of course, here, this is an Optimus 100. Beautiful stove, works beautifully, kerosene burner. I really like this one, but not very practical for my camping trips. I take a 446 with me because I like to have 3 burners and lots of grill real estate. Behind that, this is kind of a unicorn. This is Surefire number 27, made by Goldberg in Denver back in the 20s. There are a couple of these known in the collector community, but this is the only one that I am aware of that has the plain wire grate. Most of them have a solid plate with round cast iron burners. They're really neat looking. They've got the name Surefire cast into them. But this is the only one I'm aware of or that I've seen with this later simple grate. So again, this is a bit of a unicorn. And then over here we've got, these are pretty common here in Canada. It's a Rinnai double burner stove that was made for Eaton's. You can see in gold lettering there. These are nice stoves, really good build quality. There was a three burner version just like it as well. And then over here, more upcoming videos. The J.C. Higgins Trio. The stove I got from a local Boy Scout troop. Someone had painted it green and black. So into the E-tank it went, and it was repainted. The lantern, the blue lantern I picked up in the States. The stove was made by AGM. I assumed the blue lantern was made by AGM, but as I worked on it and got the paint off, I discovered on the collar it's made by Union Metalworks, not by AGM. I know both companies made this model for Sears. The one on the left is the same model lantern. I found that locally, and the fount was blown out, the whole bottom blown out. Someone had tried to weld it or tack it back in, and it wasn't working. So I ended up replacing the fount on that one. So J.C. Higgins there. So let's start back over here now. Kind of got the military thing going on here. I've got a Canadian 530 pocket stove from 1948. It's interesting to me that it's based on the GI pocket stove that was made for the U.S. military, and they were so popular that they made a civilian production version after the war, but they were only made for a couple of years in the U.S., but they were made for something like 4 or 5 years in Canada. Interesting thing. I've got a 220BX. There's a video of that restoration on the channel. I picked that up from another collector in the States. Same with this 1953 Coleman mil-spec. Probably do a video on that. It doesn't need much work. It's in nice shape already. And then back here, there's a video on this on the channel. This is an AGM 3927. This was a gasoline military lantern. They also made a red version for civilian sales. And there will be an upcoming video on this guy. This is a 3470 AGM. It's a kerosene model, and I Caswelled the fount on this with their epoxy tank sealer. It's running great. And then staying with the AGM, I started collecting just Canadian Coleman, but I've got to the point where the ones I have left to collect are pretty uncommon. So when I travel down to the States, which is where I'm originally from, not originally from British Columbia or Canada. I came here to pastor a church. So I go down there frequently. So while I'm down there, I've kind of taken an interest in American gas machines. So I've been picking these up here and there. This is actually a Sunflame 3016. I really like kind of the Art Deco look to it. And this was a great one. Usually they're stress cracked, but this was made during the war and has a steel fount. So that one, there's a video on the channel of the restoration of that. And 3 2572s. I believe these are all three of the color options they came in. There was nickel with a maroon vent, and then all maroon, and then all green. This is like a Coleman 220 or sort of to compete with it. And I actually think they run a little better and brighter than a 220 does. And then getting into the camp lights, we've kind of got the original camp light back here, RL3. The camp lights came in these 3 basic designs, and the livery and the model numbers changed over the course of the 50s. So you had the RL3 or RL33 as it later became, which was just a 2572 rebranded as a camp light. Yeah, you can see one of my other hobbies back there, my road bike and gravel bike. And then, in the mid to late 50s, you've got I think it was originally the RL2, and then it became the LRL 21A and B and LRL 22 at the end of it. It's a single. This was basically a later version of the 3016. The design is virtually identical, although the valves all went through an update in the 50s. And this is one of my favorites. This is an LRL 42. This was the big hat. It and the small one are essentially the same. It just has a larger volume fount, and it has the wide brimmed vent with the white underside, but they put out the same light. This was a neat one. AGMs weren't sold in Canada, so this thing popped up on Facebook about 4 or 5 years ago, and it was across the water on the mainland in Powell River. And so I contacted the guy and asked if he would meet me at the ferry terminal over there. So I took the ferry from here in Comox over to Powell River, about an hour and a half, 2-hour trip, and met him there and picked it up. And people were mad at me. Lots of people wanted this. He said he had over 50 people contact him, but I was the only person local enough to pick it up. He said he had people wanting him to ship it to Alaska and Florida, I think Massachusetts and Quebec. He was kind of cranky, and when I met him I realized why. He only had one arm, so someone had to drive him to the ferry. Yeah, this was a nice find. And then back to Coleman. We're back to the 1970s here. Right in the front there's the venerable 335. These things are, well, in the US someone called 220s lantern cancer. 335s are I guess the Canadian version of that. These things are everywhere. They're super common. They were made all through the 70s and into the 80s. And then behind it, 635, which is a 500 power gasoline lantern. Not super common, but they do turn up. They've got nickel founts, and some of them are painted. And this guy here is a 639. The one I put out specifically is a CP rail version. This is my one CP rail lantern, so that makes it special. That's basically the same lantern, but it's kerosene, 500 candle power. Red 335. This guy's electrified. Don't worry, it's not damaged. And also, little secret, it's not a real red 335. 335s are so common. I picked this up for free, I think, and the vent was damaged. It looked like someone put it in evaporust or vinegar or citric acid or something like that, and it was etched, and half the paint was gone. So I actually painted this one red. It's not a real one. That's why I electrified it. And I've got an easy light display here. Didn't put all the easy lights out. There are a bunch of variants, but I've got the 3 original blue ones from the mid 70s, the 321 on the left, 331 in the middle, and the 621 on the right. 331's kind of the hard to find one. And then down below, there's a 325 and a 6 on the left, 625 on the right. Those were the final version. There's a little 222 there from late 70s. And a 505, I think that's a 505A from about 1980. And those are sitting on one of the very first stoves I collected. It's a beautiful 433A that I picked up at a garage sale, I think for $5. It was used once or twice, and the O-rings went bad, and they contacted Coleman, and they sent them a new valve out under warranty. From what's it called, the parts place down in Sydney near Victoria, and they sent a 425 valve, which won't work on this. In fact, they gave me that new part from that they received back in the 80s under warranty. Never installed it. So this thing's in beautiful shape. And I won't go into the Sears model numbers because they're hard to remember and complicated, but got mid to late 60s Sears stove. That one's fully restored. It was a piece of rust when I got it. And then the 2 lanterns, these were made by Coleman. It's basically a 220 and a 228 with a few redesigns. They have different shapes and size fount than the actual Coleman versions. There's also a version that's like a 200. I actually traded these with another collector over in Vancouver. He wanted the 200 repainted and a new decal attached, and in return he gave me the 220 and 228 versions. And I think those are original. And here on the right, there's a Duracamp that's made by a company in Japan that I can't pronounce or can't remember. The lantern is a Unimet, I think it's a GL3, but it's unusual. It's the only GL3 I've seen that has these screw-in pins on the bail. And the stove is a little bit rough. I haven't done anything to it. I just picked it up last week. A friend in Victoria, a fellow collector, thanks Shane, picked it up for me last summer and had been holding on to it for me until I got down there last week while I was camping. And it's, I think, a unicorn. I've only been able to find someone who's got one other. There's a guy who collects Unimet, Union Metalworks, Hong Kong stuff, and he's got one. But I've seen really no others. I'll have to figure out what to do about the broken latch. I think Canadian Tire sells a replacement that will work. And, I could put out a whole table of ash flash, but I've just gone with the Ranger 3 stove and the late 1010 and late 1022. These are the very last versions of those two model lanterns and the stove. Lanterns, super common here. The stove, not so common, and I'm not even sure they sold that stove in the States, but the stove body is basically the same as their common propane version. The stove is interesting, the tank is interesting. It's very much like a Coleman tank. Of course, all the diameters and thread pitches are completely different, so nothing's interchangeable, and it's about a ½ inch shallower than a Coleman. But yeah, that's sort of mid to late 70s ash flash. That was made in the same factory as this Unimet stuff, about 1965, 1966 ash flash, which was based in New England and later in New York, bought Unimet's lantern and stove factory in Hong Kong, and they started producing sort of new versions of the Unimet stuff, which was actually for the most part clones of American Gas Machines models. I'm guessing that happened because Unimet was making Sears lanterns, which were based on the AGM design, and when AGM was discontinued because King Sealy bought Thermos and started making everything using the Thermos lantern designs, AGM was no longer around to complain if Unimet had those designs they were using for Sears and just started using those designs to make their own lanterns like this. So then the very first ash flash lanterns basically look the same. And then ash flash evolved, and eventually they ended up looking like this, which makes people think they're 220 clones, but they're not. They're AGM clones that just evolved. And they made those into the late 70s. And then here, I've got a double burner version of this. This is a Rinnai. Nobody knows much about these other than, of course, Rinnai. Everybody knows the company. They're best known for tankless water heaters these days. But they made these stoves very similar to the ones they made for Eaton's. This was a really interesting thing. I found the double burner version of this, which I don't have space to put out, but it's exactly the same, just two burners. Found it locally on Marketplace, and they're quite rare. And then 2 days later, a friend down in Victoria was on his way up to do some business in Courtenay, and on his way through a town on the way here, stopped in a military surplus store, and he found the 3-burner version, so he picked it up for me. So yeah, they're neat stoves. They're well built. They run really well. So anyhow, so that's everything. I mean, it's not everything. It's about, like I said, probably 2/3, 3/4 of my lanterns and about 1/4 of my stoves. Like I said, the green stoves actually were what got me into collecting, but I've since taken a greater interest in some of these oddballs, and I really like the old 1920s and 1930s stoves. If anybody's got a Model 1 or a original Model 2 or something like that they'd love to sell or pass along or trade, give me a shout, because I am looking for one of those. So anyhow, if you happen to be on the island and you're around this weekend, September 9th and 10th, feel free to drop by anytime Saturday and Sunday afternoon. So thanks for watching. See you next time.